3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Senate Education. Today is April 21st, 1:40 p.m. Starting our work with our return to H716, and this is the House Miscellaneous Education Bill. And we're just getting to the point where hopefully tomorrow we'll be able to vote this. For those who may have missed yesterday, we took one section out, which we'll work on early next week, the section having to do with whether or not to postpone or move forward with the special education rule. That's now on H101, and that's just an opportunity to give the committee a little bit more time with that. We'll get that out next week. Ms. St. James, great to see you.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing well, thanks. So would you mind taking us through what looks like now is probably or close to a finished product on 716?
Sure. That's St. James Office of Legislative Counsel. I hope you are all working with draft 6.1 with yesterday's date on it.
We are.
Okay. So the only change from yesterday is taking out section 2, as Chair Campion just mentioned. Section 1 is the amendment to the special education census grant funding for fiscal year 2023, giving supervisory unions the chance to use the average amount in that first year of census grant funding transition, the average amount it received in fiscal years 2018, 2019, and 2020, or the average amount it received for fiscal years 2019, 2020, and 21, whichever amount is greater. Section 2 on page 2 is the, oh, and I apologize, I need to update the reader assistance heading that escaped me. So I will do that and send Daphne a clean copy, but education quality standards is no longer applicable, so I apologize for that. But section 2 is Holocaust education report and recommendations, requiring the Agency of Education to issue a report on the status of Holocaust education in public schools to ensure that Holocaust education is included, and a directive that AOE shall work with the Vermont Holocaust Memorial during the development of that report. Section 3 at the bottom of page 2 is the update to section 492 in Title 16 regarding the bonding requirement for the collector and treasurer in an incorporated school district, updating the language to reflect or to allow a school district to provide crime insurance coverage in lieu of taking the personal bond that is required in current law. And section 4 is the peer review support grant program, which creates a grant program run by AOE to issue grants to organizations or school districts that have programs that support, mentor, and provide professional development to prospective educators seeking licensure through the peer review process. That comes with, on page 5, an appropriation of $712,000. It's appropriated from the education fund. And then there's an effective date in section 5 of July 1, 2022.
Anybody have any questions on the bill? Keeping in mind that last section may end up going into the yield bill. That last section may end up in H703, workforce development, or it may end up here. The other piece of this is this bill will likely go to finance. We'll vote on it tomorrow. Senator Toranzini is going to do the floor report. Ms. St. James, do you mind doing a section by section and sending it to both Senator Toranzini and myself?
Absolutely.
Great. And we'll plan on, I'll have Daphne schedule this for a vote tomorrow. Anything else from you, Ms. St. James, on this?
No,
I
I'm
see
just going to
Senator has a comment or question.
Somewhat related. 517. I spoke to Senator Kitchell. They don't have time for me today or tomorrow, but I was going to go in next week. There's no hurry to get 517 on the floor. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. While we're on that, did she have any specific questions regarding it? And there is a fiscal note on that bill. I think I talked to Secretary Bloomer in the morning. I generally, I don't know if this will change if I'm the chair again, but as a new chair, I like when things go to other committees, especially, gives them an opportunity to see it, see the work. In this case, there's a fund that they want to take a look at. That's the fund on that's already built in to go to these veterans. Question is going to be, the one question I couldn't answer was, maybe somebody else in the committee can, or maybe you, Ms. St. James. We know that that fund is not used up every year. And what I'm wondering is, and it seems to not be growing. So I think the budgetary question is, do they wipe it out every year and it goes to something else, or does it indeed grow, accumulate? Yeah.
Where's the interest going?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Do you have a question?
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Okay. All right. Senator Lyons?
No,
You okay?
I'm
Okay.
just thinking there should be language in there to protect it.
That would be really interesting if they wanted to, or certainly if we
Yeah,
wanted
we
to.
should think
Yes,
about
yeah.
Where did the money come from? Where does that money come from?
The name, I don't remember the name of the fund off the top of
On
my
this,
head, but I do have the name.
but are you saying that that could be used for?
So that it's in the bill, it's used every year, to support. Oh, I'm sorry, that's right, 517 work. It's used every year to support the veterans.
Veterans,
Yeah.
So
The question is whether or not it accumulates year after year.
Yeah.
Or if it's just wiped out and they appropriate a new fund every single year. So that's one of the questions. Yeah.
I remember seeing on VSAC's list of all the different, benefits that the Vermont
Right.
National Guard has a line item on there. So it might just be something that they do. They get a chunk of money from the state and then they break it up into different programs kind of as it's needed.
okay,
So
yeah.
maybe that's how they deal with the year to year,
Okay,
but I'm not sure.
Putting that question in an email right now. We'll track it down.
thanks. Great. Okay. 727. Daphne, you have the documents.
These things come from. Yes.
Can't get fruit just
Fruit. Where do you get them?
Costco.
Oh,
He gets everything.
I'm wearing Costco.
I know. Here you go.
He bleeds blue and gold, but he lives.
It's green and gold.
Greeting.
I know.
Blue and gold, that's my,
When you're running statewide and you're at UVM.
don't do that. Go blue and gold.
Right. Right. So the first thing we have two things before us. Before I pass them out, Ms. St. James, do you want to tell us what we're about to look at? The guardrail proposal before us and the school closure moratorium. Which one would you like to start with?
whatever the committee would like. The guardrail proposal is based on the state board's recommendations, so it may make sense to wait for them.
Okay, good. We are then going to begin with the proposal that we decided to consider to put on the table yesterday. And this is school closure moratorium and reports. So again, for those who weren't able to watch us yesterday, this is one of the options that we are considering on how to deal with what's happening with 3 towns in Addison. So with that, Ms. St. James.
Thank you, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. So based on the committee's discussion yesterday and your directive to me, I prepared this kind of orphan language for your consideration, and it does the 3 things that we talked about at the very end of yesterday's session on 727. And that is H727, and that is a section A is a moratorium on union school district school closures. Section B is a requirement for AOE to issue a report on union school district closures. And section C is a requirement for AOE to issue a report on the union school district withdrawal process. Starting with section A on page 1, it's pretty simple. There's a general notwithstanding of any provision of law to the contrary. A union school district shall be prohibited from closing a school building within its district unless the closure is approved by the district's voters residing in the town in which the building is located. For the purposes of this section, closing a school includes the complete cessation of operation of all grades within a school building, as well as the cessation of operation of fewer than all grades within the building. I think there's
So let's just pause there for a minute. So that the definition is going to be key in these conversations. So let's just take a look at that. So so say a little bit more about the latter part there, as well as the cessation of operation of fewer than all grades. So that's allowing for one grade to stop. I'm not sure I follow that 100%.
right. So the intent behind that language was to address the fact that, as you just referenced, there is no current definition, standard definition
Right.
for what does it mean to close a school. And so, I think everyone can kind of wrap their heads around, we are closing this building. It is no longer going to be used for school, and every child who attended it, regardless of the grade, needs to go to another school within the union school district, which would be all grades within the building. But what if a school were to say, we are going to close, we are no longer, the school building is going to remain a school, and it is going to continue to provide education for grades 4 through 6, but grades 1 through 3 are now going to be required to go elsewhere within the union school district. Is that a school closure? Is that a school closure in concept? Is that does that fall within the intent of what you are hoping to put a moratorium on? I think that's an open question.
I would think it's more the former than the latter. I can already hear the parents that would be concerned about those changes, but I think the intent of Act 46 is to give these districts some latitude to optimize their available resources. So I'd be hesitant to, just from my initial reaction, putting the moratorium on alterations. But if you padlock the doors and you weatherize that facility and kids don't go there for the school year, that's really what I would want to avoid, or at least put a moratorium on.
I agree.
Senator Hooker, you have an opinion on this?
I'm just trying to think, because I know that I had my first job at a school that closed incrementally.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, if that would come into play here. If they're sending their younger kids to another school so that they start out there and they let the 5th and 6th grade kids stay at the school, what does that do? So,
Senator Berkeley?
Sorry, this is already part of the conversation. Is it the fact that it says building and not, because you could close a building, not close a building, but like just say, well, we're keeping the school, we're just moving it over this other building. I mean, kind of the Senator Hooker's question, like there's other ways of closing a school than just closing the building. You could keep, right, you could send, it could be a K through 8 school and you take 6, 7, 8, move them to another school. Is that, or, leave only first and second graders.
Yeah, Senator Lance.
But this section's repealed in a year.
Right.
So all of the hypotheticals may not play out. That, so
And I wonder if a year is,
is that sufficient?
Right.
but I would say it definitely wouldn't be more than 2 years. So in my mind, is it 1 year or 2 years? Given everything else that's going on.
Right. I think it would actually end up being 2 years, but.
Yeah.
So under this circumstance, so you could, whether. I keep thinking about a school being closed as, the way Senator Chittenden described the school being closed. Locks are on, it's over. It's not as though they're moving buildings. It's not, to a different building. It's, that school, those students would now need to be dispersed, put in other schools to continue their learning. That's the way I think about that definition. Senator Birchwood.
Well, I heard another example where a district didn't close the school. They just changed. They said like, oh, this is an elementary school. You're now going to be going to elementary over here. We're going to use that for like a tech ed or special education. So the school's still open and it's still in your community. Just your kids can't go there unless they're in the special program. So
But that was still closed, that school. A new school opened, or?
no, they just like within the district,
Yeah.
they say your small town won't have an elementary school because the district is going to use it as all the special education services, and maybe something else is going to be there. And then those elementary kids will be folded into the bigger elementary school in the next town.
Yeah.
So you could say the school didn't close, the district is just using it for a purpose that's not an elementary school.
Wouldn't that example be similar to closing the school and the students again are just going to different schools? I mean, let's say they open something else there.
Well, this is school building, so that's just getting to that point. It's like
Right.
the building's still open, still being used for education,
Yeah.
just not an elementary school anymore.
So isn't the concern that these kids are not going to be educated in that community? So how do we affect that? I mean, the closing of the school and educational processes, what do you say
Or to
to make sure that it's addressing the concerns of the community?
maintain.
But it also has to be approved by the district voters.
Yeah,
Residing in the town in which the building is located. So let them make that decision. Because right now that is the issue.
But that's only for a building. They don't need to vote if they're not closing the building. The way this is, right? Like,
How
they
do
could
you want to
say,
say it? Not being used for educational purposes?
well, they could still
Kicking the kids out?
maybe maintaining the same grades or the same educational purposes, the existing educational purposes. Changes of the existing educational purposes or closing the building, which would be a change. So.
I have a question. Is there a definition of school closure anywhere in statute? Maybe we should just define it. I mean,
Right, that's what we're trying to do.
let's
Yeah.
define it. Let's say,
I wish there were one, but
School closure.
that's before us. Yeah. Senator Chittenden,
maybe we'll, Mr. Olson do that.
we may, yeah.
Even in that scenario, I feel like we're still, I don't expect school boards to play that type of game where they just really want to like mess with a community in this 1 year window.
Yeah, I don't think so.
And I would say that even in that scenario, the school building is still functional. So they're not going to turn the water off. They're not going to weatherize it. They're not going to completely defer maintenance. So I think it gives that time so that if the community gets even more riled up, they'll have this 1 year time to take the vote to make additional action.
So Ms. St. James, you get a sense, I mean, we're struggling a little bit with the definition, but we can come back to it. I don't want to get too bogged down with this right now, given that this may not even be the approach we take, but we'll flag it. And if you wouldn't mind continuing for now.
Sure. And I will note that the next section we're going to talk about is requiring a report from AOE on Union School District closures, and it asks for a definition to be developed.
That's,
Oh, well, thank
there
you.
we go.
So section B, so I hear you on the definition in section A. I hear you on that. So section B is requiring the agency of education. Again, I picked the kind of standard January 15th date that can certainly be changed, but requiring the agency of education to issue a written report to the Senate and House Committees on Education on Union School District school building closures. In preparing the report, the agency shall consult with, and then I would encourage you to consider if this list is appropriate, but the State Board of Education, the Vermont School Boards Association, Vermont Principals Association, the Vermont Superintendents Association, and the Vermont National Education Association. The agency shall also solicit and consider comments from the public. And then the contents of the report are on page 2. The report shall include an examination of examples of recent school closures or attempted school closures within union school districts, and identification of common trends and issues, an examination of the impact school closures have had or are anticipated to have on towns or member districts seeking to withdraw from a union school district, an examination of the issues leading to a school board to consider closing a school building, the options to address the issue that could be employed instead of school closure, and the impact the inability to close a school building has had or is expected to have on the union school district or any of the towns or member districts within it. An examination of the advantages and disadvantages of creating a consistent statewide process for union school district school closures and a common definition of what actions constitute a closure. Recommendations on school closures, standards and processes, and recommendations for legislative action, including recommended legislative language.
Mr. Olson, if we were to move in this direction, knowing, as you may recall, there are a couple of different approaches we're taking or considering at this point, what might you add to this study, to this report?
So thank you. For the record, Oliver Olson, Chair of the State Board of Education. I just dialed in now, so I didn't hear the full presentation. I just heard I think the latter part of the elements, but what I did hear, I think, sounded pretty comprehensive on the issues. And I think the idea of a study on these issues, what constitutes a school closure, and I think importantly, what are the sort of the standards that should be considered, I think are really important. I would suggest you might want to broaden it to beyond just school closure, but just sort of, I think it's a combination of school closure, but also school viability and sustainability, because on the other end of the spectrum, there are legitimate concerns about, at what point is a school at a point where it is no longer providing an equitable or quality education for students. So that I know Secretary French, I think, will be addressing some of this, I think. So you might want to think about how you incorporate some of those elements.
Yeah, Ms. St. James, if you would add some language that does talk about how would one determine the school's viability going forward? How does one determine that, it's a quality education? That's not exactly what I'm looking for, meeting education quality standards, that kind of thing. But the viability is key. Is there anything else that anybody else, again, at this point, wants to add, knowing that this is going to be a little slow and steady until we pass this out on Wednesday? Okay. Why don't we go ahead then to section C?
Sure. So section C is requiring another report of the Agency of Education, but this time about the Union School District withdrawal process. And I will say that if you end up going with this report requirement, that has kind of a ripple effect for what you do with H727 as far as the chunk 2. So on or before January 15th, 2023, the Agency of Education shall issue a written report. So I'm on the bottom of page 2. Written report to the Senate and House Committees on Education on the Union School District withdrawal process. In preparing the report, the agency shall, again, it's the same stakeholders as in section B, the State Board of Education, School Boards Association, Principals Association, Superintendents Association, NEA, and it's a requirement that the agency also solicit and consider comments from the public. And then starting on line 6, page 3, the report shall include an examination of the advantages and disadvantages of the withdrawal process in place on January 1, 2022 for Union School Districts, identification of alternative withdrawal process options and an examination of the advantages and disadvantages of each, identification and examination of any other issues related to the withdrawal process, recommendations for changes to the withdrawal process and related issues, and recommendations for legislative action, including recommended legislative language.
The only other question that I have right now is, I believe the committee yesterday, correct me if I'm wrong, talked about a moratorium on school closures as well as withdrawals. Withdrawals. Am I misrepresenting what the committee was?
Right.
So that probably didn't come across. This is not, would you mind drafting that piece as well? Okay.
So just so I'm clear, so a moratorium on the withdrawal process for Union School Districts, do you want that same 1-year repeal date?
Why don't we say 2 years?
2 years.
Hold on.
I thought we landed that the chunk 1 and chunk 2 sort of address the withdrawal process. Or are we just targeting these 3 communities?
I think if we do this, I think we'll likely target these 3 communities.
But we also heard that there might be others coming.
Right, but the problem is, and I think this is where we're gonna, in a minute, we're gonna sort of switch, is where we may say, hey, we recognize these folks are down the road, they've gone through a process, we really want to interrupt this process right now. So the next amendment that we're going to really be looking at is the guardrail piece. Sort of the check-in, the dipstick, sort of this is where we're at. And then if things don't happen, what do we do? Yes.
My understanding of the chunk 1 and 2 is that AOE was involved in that through Donna. So basically, the language that's in the bill came from AOE.
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want Donna to answer that? Okay. So my understanding is, so chunk 1 was the result of the working group that had been working on the, I think they've been referred to as technical, although they are large and substantive changes to Chapter 11, everything excluding withdrawal. The withdrawal language, which is chunk 2, came from a recommendation from the State Board of Education and then evolved to the version that passed the House. So it was the chunk 2, the withdrawal process language, came originally from the State Board of Education. It was not included in the chunk 1 main rewrite that was a result of the working group.
But AOE gave us that kind of policy memo about chunk 2. Like they weighed in substantially and had changes made in the House based on their testimony and desires.
No, not AOE. The state board weighed in on withdrawal. The agency did not weigh in on withdrawal. The agency loaned me, excuse me, this is Donna Russo Savage from the agency. The agency authorized me to work with the state boards to be their drafts person for withdrawal, but the agency itself was not involved in the policy considerations regarding withdrawal, except to say that the current system is not workable and that something new needs to be done.
And the House made changes to that language that came from the board that you drafted, Donna.
Correct. Based on testimony that they took from community members, superintendents, a wide range of people.
And just as a reminder, we did ask the Agency of Education if they supported the House version that left, and that was an affirmative.
Correct. You can talk with the secretary more about it, but I did receive an email from him saying, yes, we support that process.
Mr. Olson?
Yeah, and I just want to echo that the state board is supportive broadly of the language that passed out of the House regarding withdrawal, but remains concerned with the specific provision that allows these withdrawals to go forward, even if the state board makes a negative determination. So I think that's a key question, and I would strongly advocate on behalf of the board, based on our recent experience, that whether, again, and we're ambivalent as to whether it's the board or the agency or some other entity, but somebody at a statewide level needs to have the ability to stop one of these withdrawals if we determine that it's not in the best interest of students locally in the region or to the state. And we see that as a real gap right now in the House passed version. And again, based on our experience and what we're seeing, we're really concerned about that. I would strongly encourage you to modify that particular provision.
So to that end, it seems like it's a good moment now, Ms. St. James, to switch to option 2, guardrail proposal.
Oh, sure.
Okay. So you have some additional direction from us on option 1 if we were to move in that direction.
I'm not, so when you're saying option 1, are you referring to the document we just went over?
Yes.
I'm not so sure that those two documents are mutually exclusive, but I certainly have the direction on that first document.
The reason I'm thinking of them, in this way, is one really, yes, I can see where some of from both may come together, but in a way, I'm thinking about this committee, and either it's possible we may endorse the moratoriums and those 2 studies by themselves. I mean, with the, and then the other way to deal with it is the guardrails, the dipstick, all that stuff. Sort of the check-in, you're down the road, you're getting to a spot, you're about to, to take this next step, but you're really not ready in the eyes of the state.
Right. So the moratorium as drafted would be a moratorium on school closures starting from when the law went into effect and then going forward. The session law that we're about to look at, the guardrails, those withdrawal processes and consideration of the school closures that may have led to the initiation of the withdrawal process, that's already started. So the moratorium wouldn't really touch them because they've already made that decision and voted to withdraw.
Yeah. Right. Okay. No, that's helpful.
Okay.
I mean, maybe could just be the way that I'm thinking it. I continue to sort of see these as, way just 2 options, but I also see parts of them coming together. Committee.
Well, I'm a little confused about
Wait,
the whole process. It could be retroactive. It's just pulling the rug out from under you.
That's the part that I think we
can't be retroactive on stuff.
and that would keep us away from the moratoriums on the school districts that have already taken votes and move forward.
We could just say that they're on hiatus for a year.
That's a possibility.
I mean, my general position is Ripton and Lincoln are too far in the process to change it on them, but I think requiring, I don't like the term the dipstick.
I know, I keep using it.
We keep using it, we gotta come up with a better one.
The check-in.
Yeah, it's check-in, but a check-in without some kind of consequence that the board is looking for, I don't know what the value is. Maybe it helps them, maybe it helps the Board of the Agency of Education decide if they need to step in because they're like the education quality standards aren't going to be met. So there's probably value of doing it without the consequences if we can't decide on the consequences. But I feel like they're too far along to really say you can't continue. I think Starksboro already has their vote scheduled. They should be able to have the vote, but I'm okay with saying have a hold on the continuing the process till we figure out what else is the whole thing about school closures, and is the withdrawal things that we have in the bill the right way to go.
Is there any incentive that we can put in place that would have Ripton getting
Lincoln.
Lincoln, oh my God, how could I forget Lincoln? Have any incentive that we could put in place that might get them to wait until if the report comes back or some,
Well, they're already,
I know they're just.
I mean, there is the off ramp.
They have to take it.
Right.
Yeah, they have to take
There
it.
isn't
So
an
I'm just thinking,
incentive for them to take it other than their school being taken over by the state.
Right.
yeah, we don't want that.
So let me try to summarize first what I think I'm hearing. Buckle up, folks. So I think I am hearing that we're thinking about recognizing that Ripton and Lincoln
Right.
are moving. That being said, we're concerned that Ripton and Lincoln may run into problems very soon, and there does need to be a check-in. And if that check-in is not met, it is the state's responsibility. It's going to be someone's responsibility to be the adult in the room and say, hey, folks, this is not we're concerned that what your lack of preparedness is going to be bad for kids. You know, it's going to cause instability in the schools. You're going to keep whatever the outcome is. But there is that concern with those two districts. We are also, so there's that piece. At the same time, we are, and I think rightfully concerned, what withdrawals and moratoriums or withdrawals and closures might be in the future. And so we would still, at the same time, want to study both of those things, as well as perhaps consider a moratorium on closures and withdrawals. Committee.
You're saying a study on moratoriums and closures.
I mean,
No problem.
Not a study of a moratorium.
not the state moratorium, but yeah, on
The moratorium
to
on
understand, to get
closures
some
and
information.
withdrawals.
But not Ripton and Lincoln.
But not Ripton and Lincoln, because to your, I think, very valid point, they've done what they've done. But I think it is in the state's best interest to make certain that the best interest of kids, that come July, come certain points, there's a check-in, and if that check-in is not met, then the state, somebody has to intervene and say, folks, we appreciate your passion, we appreciate your commitment, but this does not look viable.
And Starksboro is left out because they haven't taken their vote yet. Even though
They've warned their vote for May.
Yeah.
Which I think they should be allowed to have the vote. They could vote not to withdraw.
Correct.
So then,
Yeah.
but if they vote to withdraw, there would be a moratorium for them to go to the next step until this work is done. If they want one. Or at least some.
How does that feel in terms of? And I think, Ms. St. James, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's when you said these two things aren't going to necessarily be mutually exclusive. That's sort of the possible combination. Is that?
Yes, it's all a policy decision, obviously, what you do, but yes,
Some confirmation from somebody at this point, please.
And I think that we would still do chunk one.
Yeah,
We would still do chunk two with some changes.
yeah,
And then chunk 3/stow would go forward. And then the other parts of chunk 3 would be amended to be this one.
but what we just sort of framed.
Yeah, that works.
Can I just ask that, there was some talk about Lincoln, Ripton and Starksboro coming together as a district. So I hate to, just kind of cut off Starksboro from that whole conversation.
I don't know if we would be.
If they're not allowed to, well, they can take their vote. Not allowed to
Right.
go forward.
I mean-
These others have already worked on what they need.
My understanding that the timing, if what we heard from Mr. Olson yesterday was that there's not enough time for Starksboro to go through the whole process and form a supervisory union with Ripton and Lincoln, and the time that Ripton, I don't know about Lincoln, but Ripton's got to figure this out by next year. So there's not enough time for them to have this 3-town supervisory union. That's my understanding, if I'm correct. Isn't that what you told us, Mr. Olson?
Oliver?
Yeah, so just to clarify, so Ripton is scheduled to go live July 1st next year, 2023, as a supervisory district. Now, what the proposal that's been floated by Lincoln, and the state board heard from Lincoln yesterday, is they're looking at the idea of creating a supervisory union. So it's really important. Remember, they all want to remain independent school districts. What they want to do is essentially form a supervisory union. So Ripton would be creating initially a supervisory district, but I think ultimately they would want to separate that out into a supervisory union that would cover 2 or potentially 3 towns. So that's kind of what they're looking to do. If I could, I just want to go back to some of the discussion I just heard and offer just a sort of a reflection, and that is that with
Is this back
these,
to when we were sort of summarizing where we think we're at?
yes, yeah,
Okay.
just the summary that I just heard, I think was helpful. Just another thought is, as with this check-in that we do with these districts that are already in process, we will have gone almost the entire way through the process by the time we get to the check-in. So the state board will have sort of the full gamut of experience dealing with these withdrawals at that stage. And
Okay.
I think the learnings from that will inform sort of the study, if you will, in many respects. And also I would suggest that if we come back and say, listen, these guys aren't ready to go, we can not only report that back and pause this activity, but that becomes part of the findings and lessons, if you will, become part of the study that come back to the legislature. So there will be an opportunity for those districts to say, hey, listen, the state board didn't give us a fair shake, and we really think we're ready to go. So I would characterize it as kind of a pause, a stay, if you will, pending further review. And then when it comes before you next year, if that were to happen, you'd have sort of all of our analysis and the findings as part of the study to understand what went into that decision, and then that could inform some further action if you felt that that those districts should move ahead. I don't know if that helps.
Senator
So just to clarify, you think the process that Ripton and Lincoln are in and in Starksboro should be paused?
No, that
Shouldn't be allowed.
no, I think let it continue, but the check-in, the idea is we would have this check-in, and that the check-in would have the ability to pause the process and essentially refer it back to the legislature, along with the analysis and findings that led to a decision. Now, we could find that everything's good to go, and we would let them move ahead. But if we did find through that progress check-in that they were not ready to go, I think it's important that we have the ability to pause that process and refer it back to the legislature for further review. And I'll give you an example. I just had sent to Daphne, because just to put a point on this and to help illustrate our concerns, I had Daphne send the committee a link to the minutes of the Ripton School Board from last night. And if you pull that up, number 4 in the minutes speaks to some of the staffing issues. And they apparently have reached out to the staff in the school, and none of the staff in the school plan to stay there. So these are the kinds of data points that we're hearing as a board and getting very nervous about the path that they're on.
Okay, so more than a check-in, it's more like a checkpoint where they stop at the checkpoint and they can't go forward
Yeah.
unless Board of Education lifts up the gate.
Exactly. Yep.
And if it doesn't lift up the gate, they get pull over to this legislature for a solution.
Yeah.
So it becomes more like a
That sounds nicer, rest.
Yeah, it does.
Mandatory rest
Yeah.
area.
Yeah.
it becomes more like a akin to a charter change, right?
Right. So, Ms. St. James,
Yes.
what do you need from us? You've heard our summary, where we're generally the direction we would like to move in now. Hold on, Senator Perschlick. Go ahead, we're gonna add something to that transportation analogy. Come on.
No, I just wondered, back to my overview when I said we were gonna do chunk 2, but if we're doing chunk 2, which allows a process for withdrawals, we also talked about a withdrawal moratorium. So I just wanted to be clear. Are we doing both of those? We're setting up the withdrawal process, but we might change it because we're also asking for a study on withdrawals. So we're like kind of saying, we think this is the right thing to do. We're gonna pass it, but we're gonna put a hold on it so it doesn't go into effect for a year so we can have a second look at it. You know what I mean?
I think I do. So in my mind, yes, so we are, tell me if, I was thinking, again, just to summarize, we've got Ripton, Lincoln doing their thing, the check-ins, whether or not the state board would move them forward or not. Everybody else, we still put a moratorium around withdrawals as well as closures with the 2 studies where we would come back and say, all right, now we do have this additional information. Well, then I think it's up to the next legislature. Is your question whether or not we would maybe take that information and make further policy that could say no more withdrawals or no more closures?
The question is, I agreed with what you just said.
Yeah.
But if we do that, then we wouldn't really need to do chunk 2, which is all about future withdrawals.
Future.
So do we,
Yeah.
so because we talked about some changes to section 2, but do we hold off on that because we're saying there's not going to be any
Thank you.
withdrawals?
I'm sorry that I was confused. Ms. St. James, it sounds like we would.
This is a choice for you. I think
No, I
Senator
understand,
Perchlik.
but I just, generally, it sounds like if we did both, it wouldn't make sense.
That's for you to decide what makes sense. So I think Senator Perchlik raised the exact point that I was going to raise, and that is, if you require the withdrawal, if you put a moratorium on withdrawals, you're just stopping the process, which is fine. You could make a new withdrawal process and still stop the process, or you could keep the old process and still stop it. But if you are creating a brand new withdrawal process, which is chunk 2,
Right.
and requiring a study to figure out what the best way to go about withdrawals in a union school district
Then
is, they
section 2
seem
is
to
not
kind of
needed.
cancel.
You've already
Yeah,
done
thank
it.
you.
Yeah.
Mr.
You could
Olson?
do it.
Okay.
So if I could make a suggestion that might simplify this, again, I think the chunk 2, I think, is a robust solution. If you were to, I think chunk 2 is a robust solution. And I think there's a way forward here where you wouldn't need a moratorium on the closures, but if you were put some guardrails in place that allow the board or the agency, some entity at the statewide level, to have the ability to stop an ill-conceived withdrawal from moving forward, and then combine that with a study that comes back to the legislature, right? So essentially, let the process in chunk 2 move forward. if there are withdrawals where the Board of Education or the agency, depending on who you want to be the decision maker, says no, a particular withdrawal should not move forward, there could be a report that goes back to the legislature to say, hey, here's where, like an annual report, like we've considered these withdrawals, we approve these, here was the rationale for why we approve these are the ones we disapproved, and here was our rationale. So we report that back to you, perhaps on an annual basis over the next few years. You get a sense of what's happening on the ground, and the opportunity to have some oversight over the board or the agency, and potentially reverse course if those communities feel that they were wronged, right? So it's almost like an appeal. So you're getting data on what's happening on the ground. You wouldn't need to have a moratorium on that. And then similarly, as I was thinking about the school closure moratorium, I think the school closure issues are hyper localized in some of these communities, and you might want to hear testimony from the superintendents in that region. My understanding is that there are no imminent school closures on the table. There were studies looking at sort of long-term facility plans, and there was a prospect in the future of potential closure. And I think that's what got people really concerned. So if you're going to do the study, and I think the study makes a lot of sense on the whole school closure issue, because we need to resolve a lot of these issues and ultimately find a good solution here. I think wait for the study to come back. I don't think there's an urgent need to address a moratorium. So I think there's a path forward here to move forward without any moratoriums, have the studies, and get feedback on an annual basis from the board on what's happening with withdrawals.
Senator Lyons.
So that all sounds very reasonable, but I guess my question is, given what has been said about Starksboro, what would happen without the moratorium?
So they've
warned the vote.
Yeah, they've warned the vote. So I would suggest that they should go forward under the you'd probably need to address that with some session law. So I think a similar process as we've contemplated for Ripton and Lincoln, where there would be a check-in at some point.
But that would let them go forward?
If they even, I mean, we don't even know how they'll vote.
Right.
But yes.
Right, we don't know how the vote, but they would go.
Okay.
They would go forward, but there would still be this check-in, and if it looked like they were on a good path, they would move forward. If it looks like they were on a path that wouldn't lead to success, the board would have the ability to say no, and again, that we would report that back to you as part of our annual reporting on this activity.
Okay.
But Starksboro wouldn't have to comply with chunk 2 as we know it.
Not here.
They could go on with under the old system.
That's a good question. Ms. St. James?
So right now, in chunk 3, the last section says, if a town that wants to withdraw from a union school district has taken a vote, but the towns within the union school district have not done their vote, then if H 727 becomes law, they have to start all over again under the new law. That's what's in this bill right now. So you could require something different, but as I think it's chunk 7, or I'm sorry, not chunk 7, section 7. It's just something to think about. If there's I know, no more chunks. If you do not do a moratorium on withdrawals, or even if you do and you make an exception for anyone who's at least started the process, you need to make a decision on what law applies to them if you want that process to go forward. Do they start over under the new law because all they've done is taken a vote of the town that wants to withdraw? Or because they have taken that vote, do you want them to be able to continue the process under current law with some kind of built-in check-ins that you have in chunk 3 for the withdrawals that are currently underway that have all been initiated under current law.
Sarah Burchell.
May I,
So right
Oops.
now, chunk 3 for those other districts that have already started, they're not held to any new standard, which is the Board of Education's concern that they move forward under the old law, right?
So kind of. So chunk 3, as passed by the House, does require reports back to the agency of the Board of Education, which is not something that's contemplated in current law. So there are some additional kind of study and reporting requirements, but it allows them to continue. What you have before you today, based on state board that we have not walked through yet, is the guardrail proposals that do put in whatever term you want to use, a check-in, the adult in the room, whatever term you want to use. So
Tips.
yeah.
Limbo bar.
I see the hand. Ms. Russo Savage.
I'm going to repeat what Ms. St. James just said, that this is entirely your policy decision to make, but I just wanted to point one thing out, that as the House has passed it for Starksboro, because it is impossible for the other towns to vote prior to the effective date of the act, they would go under whatever new law you required. If instead you were to say all a district needs to do is vote to withdraw before the effective date, which would apply to Starksboro, and if that's the case, then the current law applies, then that actually means that as long as 5% of the voters in any town in the state submit a petition by probably mid-May, they could have a vote prior to the effective date of this act. So I don't know that it would encourage other towns that were thinking about it to move forward, but I think it might possibly have the unintended consequence of having a lot more places decide they want to jump forward and try to get in under the old law because it's perceived as less onerous. And all they would have to do is have 5% of the voters file a petition by early to mid-May to do that.
They have the vote.
It's not terrible to me.
So I think right now, we should take a look at the guardrail piece that Ms. St. James has put forward, has already drafted for us. I believe our next draft of the bill, I may be wrong on this, but I think Ms. St. James, unless someone objects, we're going to ask to see the full bill soon that will contain basically, I think, what we've continued to summarize here, which is likely some kind of, guardrail language, whether or not we'll wait to hear from Oliver Olson as to whether or not he feels as though it's strict enough as a check-in and as a spot that would help the state, give the state board some direction on whether or not when schools are withdrawing, they can, the state board would authorize it or not. Just to sort of see. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I just want to clarify, in case it's not already clear, that the guardrail language right now only appears in the session law. So it only appears in relation to withdrawals that are currently underway. The version of the withdrawal process for anyone after H727 passes, the version that you have before you that passed the House does not have any guardrails in it.
That's why we are going to put them in.
Okay.
Right?
Well, let's look at.
I mean, that's what I have in my hand that you gave me. No.
There's the guardrail.
The guardrail language that you have in front of you, it's 19 pages, is just addressing the session law.
Okay.
For the withdrawals currently underway. And if I misunderstood, then I apologize, but this would be an easy fix.
Continue your thought.
Chunk 2,
Yeah.
we haven't talked about adding guardrails to chunk 2 yet. At least from a drafting standpoint. I think in this conversation, you've begun to do that, but you haven't looked at the guardrail language yet.
Okay, Mr. Olson.
I might be able to help here. So I think Ms. St. James has it spot on. The guardrails. So it's important to remember that chunk 2 has guardrails built into it with one exception, but the process that we've laid out is much more robust. The requirements for the study, the analysis, et cetera, that we don't have with the one, that's the problem. We don't have the ones that are in process. There is no requirement for any analysis or any study. And we've seen that happen. So the guardrails.
So I'm going to stop you there just to make sure we're on the same page. So you are in agreement that what is in chunk 2, those guardrails are enough going forward for withdrawals.
The guardrails are for future ones are spot on with one exception, and that is there's no gate, right? So that the board would say, get rid of the advisory opinion and the 60% supermajority, and replace that with the board having the ability to stop something from happening. So there's some actual.
Does anybody oppose that?
No.
No, please.
I'm not, I might,
Yeah.
You might oppose which part?
that they would be able to stop it. Like, I think if everything is, if they did all the work, like I think it's a big change from where it was to withdraw, right? And there's all this analysis that having the board say no, I'm not confident that I'm comfortable with that without looking at it more.
But we're talking about, saying no with reason.
Correct. Absolutely. I mean, the board is not opposed to school districts withdrawing. We want withdrawals to be successful. And our concern is that we've seen some examples where there really isn't any study or analysis, and people are on quite frankly, on a really bad path. And we need to have the ability, and again, we're agnostic. It doesn't have to be us. It could be the agency, could be the legislature, but somebody at the statewide level needs to be the arbiter to say, this analysis is solid, the plan is solid, this is going to be successful, and kids are not going to be harmed. That's really important.
Senator Perslow.
So I guess I have to go back and look at the other requirements
In section 2.
in section chunk 2.
Chunk 2, yeah.
And because I feel like the House had this discussion, and I think they felt like it was the balance of saying, we're going to require all this analysis and study and reporting ahead of time to make sure that they're ready. If the board still feels like they're not ready, it still leaves the control of the local community to decide, well, we disagree with the board, we still want to go forward. And then if they fall off the rails, then there are other protections. If they can't meet the quality standards, or if there's not enough faculty run the school.
Right.
But I think because of all this other stuff they put into chunk 2, it's a lot more unlikely than we had with schools that might more like just get mad and want to separate and then hold on to that without that, didn't do the analysis and didn't realize the teachers were going to leave and didn't realize that other supervisory unions.
They really have to look at these things.
Yeah, they have to say, where are you going to get your special education?
Right.
So that would all be part of the process. That's not part of the process, or wasn't part of the process for
Ripton and Lincoln. So that's a decision point we'll have to make. What I'd like us to do now is the session law piece, which would address the Ripton and Lincoln situations. Okay?
Yes.
So I'm going to pass this out, and then I need to go to finance. When I come back,
Oh, no.
I'm dying to know the decision.
I have to go to approach at 3.
I need to go down there just for hopefully 10 minutes. I think it's okay.
Okay, vice chair's in charge.
Vice chair's in charge.
Okay, go ahead, Senator Presley. I did have a question with,
So before we,
go ahead,
no,
because you have to
I'm
leave.
not gonna leave. So I just want to make sure, the next step would indeed be, I feel like I'm, Ms. St. James, for you to take everybody through this.
Through
that
the
okay with
the guardrail
Yeah.
language? Yeah,
Yep.
happy to do that right
Okay.
now. I also want to point out that I did a side-by-side for you back when we started H 727 with a side-by-side of the withdraw with chunk 2 as it passed the House
Yeah,
and the original State Board of Education proposal. If you have a side-by-side of that, the original State Board of Education proposal for chunk 2 had a similar mechanism that we're about to look at built into the withdrawal process.
all right, let's stop there.
Okay.
I think sometimes let's just stick with this. Take everybody through this, that would be great.
Sure.
Okay.
Is everyone looking at a 19-page document that says SBE guardrail proposal with 419 at the top?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So the sections correspond to the same. So we'll just start with section 4. So section 4, the changes are in yellow, highlighted in yellow. So nothing about the applicability of this section has changed. This is this section applies only to a withdrawal action that's been initiated under current law, and the state board has given final approval to the voter approved and voter ratified proposal to withdraw from the Union School District. This on page 2, it still requires that the new school district submit a status report to the State Board of Education, detailing how it intends to be operational, all the steps it has taken to ensure that it will be operational. It still requires the state board to review that report and make findings. And so I'm on page 2, line 15. So if the state board, again, the same as what you've already reviewed, if the state board determines that likely the new school district will be prepared, then the new school district can continue on its way, and she'll continue to take all actions necessary to prepare for the realignment of the duties on the operational date. Starting on page 3, this is the new guardrail proposal. So if the state board deems that preparedness would be unlikely, so if the state board determines there's a reasonable risk that the new district will not be able to be prepared on the operational date to assume the full responsibility for the education of its residents in a manner that substantially complies with educational quality standards and to ensure the provision of supervisory union services, then the prior declarations of the state board concerning withdrawal from the Union School District are void as of the state's determination of reasonableness.
Did you have a question?
May I make a comment, Elizabeth? So Senator Perchlick's previous point on line 4 of page 3, that term reasonable risk, would you feel more comfortable if it was a probable likelihood or a probable risk that the new district would not be able to be prepared on the operational date? You were concerned that they might oppose, or
What's reasonable?
what's reasonable as opposed to likely or probable?
I'm not sure, because I haven't really digested the other part. What happens if they do that?
So I interrupted too soon, my apologies.
So basically what this says is, if the state board deems that preparedness will be likely, the new school district continues on its way, preparing for the operational date. If the state board determines that preparedness is unlikely, there's no withdrawal. It undoes everything that it's already done, and the new school district is sent back to be a member of the Unified Union School District. And then they have the option of starting the withdrawal process all over again under the law that is in place at that time. That's the gist of it.
Be high risk.
So in the event that the state board says you're not prepared, and the town feels, or the district feels that they are, they have to go all the way back to the beginning if they want to continue that, or they can continue to be part of the district that they're already in.
Correct.
So what's on the other 14 pages?
Well, so that was for section 3, right? So that was for that section only applied to a certain situation. So section 5 applies to a different situation, and that so it's similar concepts but applicable to the specific situation. So for section 5, the change occurs. If we go down to page 7, everything, if the state board determines that preparedness is likely, everything is the same. Remember, this is the STOW situation, so it's requiring an update to their alternative governance structure report and contemplates some back and forth there in updating the state board on how they will be operational. Remember, this situation, there has not been a withdrawal approval by the State Board of Education yet. So everything up to preparedness deemed likely remains the same. The state board shall approve the withdrawal process if it deems that the proposed new school district will be operational in time. The change happens on page 7, and that's where there's the preparedness at risk amendments to plan and timeline. So for this situation, this proposal requires that if the state board determines there is a reasonable risk that the criteria set forth in subdivision 2 of the subsection will not be met by the operational date, then the state board shall explain its concerns to the petitioning town and the union district, determine in consultation with the petitioning town and the union district a date by which the petitioning town and the union district shall present a revised explanation and plan for the state board review and action under subdivision 2 of this subsection C. So if there's an initial determination that preparedness is at risk, there's a consultation there, and the state board is asking for an updated an update on how they're going to become operational. So we're not done yet, though. If preparedness is deemed likely, they can the state board shall approve the withdrawal process, and then the school district, pages 8 starting on line 3 through to the top or middle of page 9, is everything that new proposed school district needs to do in order to become operational. Starting on line 13 on page 9, so the school board's already made a determination that there's a concern about their preparedness. They've said, come back to us, go back to the drawing board, convince us again that you can be prepared. And so on page 9, line 13, if the state board cannot make a positive determination of preparedness, either after that initial review or after review of subsequent plans, then it's the same thing that happens in section 3. Then the state board, well, it's a little different, but the state board shall declare that the petitioning town's proposal to withdrawal initiated under current law is denied. So remember, in section 3, they had already approved the withdrawal process. So I'm sorry, in section 4. So in section 4, they were undoing that. In section 5, they haven't voted, the state board has not voted on the withdrawal request yet. So now the state board is saying, no, you cannot withdraw. We're denying your proposal to withdraw. The petitioning town remains a town within the union district, and the state board's determination is final. And then if the voters in this situation want to start the withdrawal process all over again, they'd have to do so under law at that time, whether that's current law because it hasn't been changed, or H727 in whatever iteration gets voted out. Any questions with that?
Did you say that this section 5 was what we called the STOW, or is this the Lincoln?
Yeah, this is STOW.
Okay.
Section 6 again, applies to the same set of circumstances. So it's a union district that was formed by the voters. There's been a vote to withdraw by the petitioning town. The member towns or the towns within the union school district have all approved the withdrawal process, the withdrawal proposal. And now the decision is sitting with the State Board of Education to approve that. If the state, it remains the same. If the state board, they have to submit a report to the State Board of Education detailing how they, the strengths and challenges for the proposed new school district, that analysis about the educational advantages and disadvantages, the financial advantages and disadvantages, et cetera. And they also have to describe how they are going to become operational. The state board still reviews that plan, no change there. I'm on page 14. Again, if the state board deems that it's likely that the proposed new school district on the proposed operational date will be able to assume full responsibility, then it shall vote to approve the withdrawal. Nothing there has changed. And then if you skip to page 15, line 5, if the state board determines there's a reasonable risk that all of the analysis they had to do, the criteria set forth in subdivision 2 will not be met by postponing the proposed operational date, then the state board shall declare that the petitioning town's proposal to withdraw under the under current law is denied. So can't go any further. The town remains a member of the union school district. The action is final. And if the voters want to initiate the withdrawal process, they'd have to do so under current law at that time. There has been no change to section 7, which is the section that addresses a petitioning town that has taken a vote and approved a withdrawal proposal, but the vote has not been finalized in the other towns within the union school district.
Did you have a question?
Not a question, but these all seem very reasonable to me, and I support, or want to hear more reaction, of course, to those that understand it better. I know Senator Lyons needs to leave for 3, and the cafeteria closes at 3, and people, if anybody want a cup of coffee or anything, that would be a good time for a break. But.
Actually, and Secretary French has to come, is coming at 3 and has a hard stop at 3:30, so we want to make sure that we're starting at 3 with him. So what's your pleasure as far as the guardrails go?
Well, just a quick question. Can you just give us the cheat sheet on who section 6 would apply to? Is that Lincoln and Ripton or just Lincoln?
Ripton is number 4. Stowe is number 5. Lincoln is number 6. But again, those sections would apply to any town that fits that criteria.
Sure. And what section 7, why was that done? Just in case it happened before? I believe that's the Starksboro situation. Right. Okay. All right. I think we should take a break.
So we'll take a break for a couple of minutes, and Senator Lyons has to go to.
I'll be back.